As I was saying, and in conclusion, are both expressions that you don't expect to hear at the beginning of a lecture. But now you know when I started it that that was an expression. Now if you missed it because of the microphone, I'll say I started by saying, as I was saying, which is not as funny now, and in conclusion. And the reason I'm starting that way, though, is because Haydn often starts pieces and constructs his pieces in syntactical ways that are sort of like starting a lecture by saying, in conclusion. But also, by talking like this, you're not thinking about Haydn. You're thinking about me. But that is also thinking about Haydn, because Haydn makes you think about him when he writes, instead of the music sometimes. Like, oh, the composer's doing something funny. Now, if I were to tell you a story about Haydn, about how he got in trouble as a child, which he did, and the things that happened to him in school, you would suddenly be in the world of Haydn. But if I interrupted that story to point out something about it, you would lose the story, but it might be worth it. So this is all about digression. And Haydn, you won't forget this, I hope. And if I mention geese now, it's because it should come back later, because that's another Haydn technique, which is to discuss diversion and detours and then give you a glimpse of something which you have no idea what it's doing there, and then it comes back later. So I hope remind me to get to the geese, which I expect to do. So as an example, before we get to the piece we're going to discuss in more detail, the Opus 50, number 5, which we're going to look at the first movement, it's not a very long movement. So I thought that we'd also take a quick look at some of the other Opus 50 quartet openings, because if you really get a handle, which is, don't even. I mean, really, that is so beneath you. If you get if you understand the humor in diversion, digression, and in not quite saying what's expected, which is what I'm trying to convey, which I do at my own risk, because if you don't know me, you think this guy can't, you think, like, how many people in this country can't finish the sentence? who have national platforms. But not finishing a sentence when you are doing it on purpose in order to get somebody pulled into a construction that becomes brilliant is something else again. Okay, so let's hear the opening for a moment of Opus 50, number 1. Now, ask yourself as you listen to this, or just monitor your reaction to the opening. I'm not kidding around with this. I didn't rewrite this. This is Haydn. Go ahead. All right, that's the opening of a quartet. Now, probably, you didn't laugh like when I said in conclusion, but it starts in a way that at that time was disturbingly funny because it's syntactically wrong. Let me explain a little bit. Now, it already means you do have to really get the humor, you have to know something about what's expected, which is true of all humor. Humor is tricky. But what I would like to try to do is to fine-tune your expectations of what happens in the classical sonata structure, which isn't really a structure. As I always say, it is so not a form. So now, here, all right, geese. Why geese? Because geese, when they're born, are imprinted with the first thing that they see. Konrad Lorenz wrote a lot about this, and if geese see a dog first, they think dog is its mommy. If they see whatever animal they see first, and it even works for an inanimate object briefly. So this has been shown. Now, human beings in terms of a lot of classical music, it's a similar thing. When you hear a chord or a note, you assume without even thinking at all, you just feel that that must be the key. That's what it's about. So for example, this starts with the key in the cello. And therefore, what normally would happen would be, or something like, but Haydn doesn't give you the chord, he just starts. Now, it's not a riot. So he does give you first the actual mother goose, the key. He actually gives you the key, okay? I didn't even expect to say that. So he gives you the key here, but if you think about the openings of most pieces of music, you will get, especially at that time, and for many, many years after, you will get a chord that is the key, the tonic, and the dominant. So for example, he should have done this. Let's hear this again, because not only does he not give you the chord, he starts on the dominant. It is also dissonant. Now, you don't start pieces in the classical period, supposedly, with dissonance like this. That's the first chord you hear. You're supposed to hear. But now let's see again. And maybe when you play it, think how strange it is. That's all. Just think let's see if it changes anything. I don't know. Okay, now, there's one instrument, the second violin, is holding a long note. Let's just hear the cello and the second violin. Can you imagine at that time? Try to imagine what that sounded. Let's hear it again, and maybe you should play slightly more because it's so irritating. Let's do it with everybody. With everybody. Okay, good. Now, that's enough about that for a moment. But let's take a look at number 2 from the same opus. This is the opening of the second string quartet, opus 50. You know, the opus is the collection, and then there are quartets within it. So this is in C major, and it does start with C major. C major chord. It says sottovoce, means quietly, or half voice. All right, let's hear what happens here. Listen carefully. Okay, now, this is funny or strange in a different way. This is all about expectations. Now, Haydn, by this point, had written a lot of music, and other people were considered great composers too, people we've forgotten about. Antonín Kamel. Anybody know that name? Probably not. He was so well known when Haydn was young that people thought some of Haydn's early pieces were by Antonín Kamel, and some of Kamel's pieces were credited to Haydn because the style was very similar. But what happened to Haydn is he developed into this much more sophisticated and often extremely funny and sometimes tragic composer, whereas Kamel stopped composing after a while, and it remained this very polite kind of music. And the polite kind of music didn't continue. Now, what we just heard has a couple of interesting little problems. First, and it's partly because of our 21st century ears that we don't hear these problems until they're pointed out. And then a sforzando on the next note to get rid of it. Do you have a sforzando? Okay. Now, the other thing is after this we get a unison, everyone together. That is a little bit peculiar because it was the tradition to start pieces with a unison statement, perhaps, not to bury it in the middle of the statement. So the more you know about composition from this time, the more, and the audience, it's not that they had to know, but they go to concerts, they hear these pieces, and everything he's doing is somewhat off. He has a dissonance early on. It starts quietly instead of loud, and then the unison thing, which instead of starting the piece, is in the middle. But then, when he comes back with this, when that comes back later, it sounds like this. Wait a minute. What happened to the cello, first of all? Remember, it started like this. The cello seems to be playing the same note all the time. Play the opening as if there's something wrong with you, and you only know how to play one note. Let's try that. Let's try that. And the C sharp against that should be a little bit uncomfortable. Let's try it. Okay, so then it comes back, and it seems like they've told her, just stay out of it. And here's when it comes back. This is what it sounds like. Yeah, and she comes back in when the chord gets really dramatic. Sorry. On a C sharp. So again, this is not laugh out loud for us anymore, but it might have been. Might have been, because it's strange. And I think this is a question for performers now, is do you want audiences to get all these jokes that in a way we don't have the environment for? It's tricky. It would be very hard without somebody lecturing before every single concert. Okay, but now, number 6 is by far the weirdest one. Number 6 from Opus 50. We'll come back to number 5, which we're going to look at in more detail. This is one of the strangest openings. Now, remember the geese, because if you're a goose, baby goose or gosling, and the first thing you see is an E, then you think you're an E major. All right, let's try this. Okay, now that's all they have. I only gave them one page. Now, all right, the piece could start in measure 4. Let's start in measure 4. Okay, now to make it more normal, if they did this first, which is not written there. See, now that's how this, can you do something like that? It doesn't matter if it works. And then start in measure 4, or maybe just a D major, dum bum 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 bum, something like that, and then go on to measure 4. Okay, now that is much more typical. The opening. How about this? Let's do something else, because Haydn liked to do this. Just play a D major chord, 2 strong ones, just so you're going like this. And then bong. Okay, now, everybody talk amongst yourselves, and when you hear that, stop and pay attention. Just talk for a moment. Go ahead. Go ahead. Okay, now, that's what those were for. They're called noise stoppers. They really are. Haydn and later other people, but Haydn wrote those things like dum, bum, or sometimes just one big chord, bum, and then the piece begins. He did that to get people to stop talking, especially when he wrote at Esterházy, because the prince was always talking to everybody, and the only audience for the premiere probably was the prince alone, except for the 25 servants. And therefore, if they were all talking or the prince was eating something loud, like potato chips or something. Then in order to get him to stop, you have to have a big chord like that. Okay, so back to the actual piece. Let's hear how this really begins again. Number 6. All right. Okay. The first note is an E. This is really a very, I'm hoping that you'll see that this is an extremely strange opening. My phone is talking to me. Okay. Here. All right. When I said, as I was saying, that's what this is. He's in the middle of something. And maybe people thought, wait a minute, did we miss the opening of this or something? Maybe that's what he wanted them to think. Because it sounds like that. Not only is there an E and the piece is in D, do you see how crazy that is? The piece is this. But it starts, it's absolutely wild. So not only that, but it doesn't have any rhythm. It goes, what's the tempo? It's just falling into place. Haydn couldn't write at the time. There was no tradition to write no rhythm, like a composer could now. If you just want to go da-da-da-dum, you could write it so that it's totally free. But he had to write it in some time signature. But probably he didn't really want it in a time signature. It's just, and then it clicks. Now we got a key. We have a time signature. It's time signature. Now we've got a piece of music. So this is very strange. He starts with a digression. He starts in the middle. This is very un-Western. In India, you could go to a concert in the middle and it's fine. Concert may be 7 hours long and you walk in at hour 3. And if someone's playing an E, so what? But that's a different tradition. With Haydn, he created this sense, and he really is the first composer to do this, and it's a significant thing. He created the sense of interrupting and diverting and detour, digression as being part of the style of classical music. And everyone picked up on it in different ways, nobody quite the way Haydn did. And the whole idea of structure in the classical period was to set up expectations that either dramatically or comically go into conflict or go astray and then get straightened out. Because what you want in a classical piece, and a lot of things that we call a work as opposed to an improvisation or a song, a work of art, what you want is a sense of resolution and everything being solved at the end. Well, you can't have that if you don't have problems. So in order to achieve resolution and either triumph or happiness or transcendence, you have to set up problems, which means that if you follow strict forms and everyone writes in the same forms, you're not going to have any problems. Everyone knows exactly what's going to happen. So in fact, there are no forms. I mean, they're very vague, A, B, A. Well, that's not that restrictive, and the sonata concept that Haydn sets up is really a procedure, a dramatic procedure, like a courtroom procedure. Because in a courtroom, you could go to sit on a jury, or you could be a lawyer or a judge, and what you might have is a fender bender, and it's not very interesting. But it could be a murder trial. It could be anything. Because the form of it is not really a form, it's a procedure that allows for the simplest little problems and these gigantic problems all to be looked at in the same somewhat orderly fashion, but things always go astray because of the human element and the drama itself. Now, before we get to the actual Opus 50, number 5, I think one way to make this really, really clear is to talk about it in literature. The same thing happens in literature. One of the most famous writers for doing what Haydn did is a modern writer, Italo Calvino. So I'll read 2 short little passages from Calvino because what he does is very Haydn-esque and very classical, although it's modern, in that he makes you aware of the fact that he is writing at all kinds of weird moments and that he's playing with your attention as a reader. And that's what Haydn does, by starting with the wrong places, by interrupting, by having the wrong key, by putting phrases in the wrong order. So here's something this is the opening of his novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. which already is, you're saying, what was that title? Okay. I'm reading you the actual first paragraph. The novel begins in a railway station. A locomotive huffs steam from a piston, covers the opening of the chapter. A cloud of smoke hides part of the first paragraph. In the odor of the station, there is a passing whiff of station cafe odor. There is someone looking through the befogged glass. He opens the glass door of the bar. Everything is misty inside, too, as if seen by nearsighted eyes or eyes irritated by coal dust. The pages of the book are clouded like the windows. Anyway, one more sentence. The cloud of smoke rests on the sentences. All right, that's pretty cute. Now, later on, chapter 2 begins this way. And this really, for me, is just like Haydn, but then we're going to go into Haydn's time, because people occasionally wrote like that then also. You have now read about 30 pages, and you're becoming caught up in the story. At a certain point, you remark, this sentence sounds somehow familiar. In fact, this whole passage reads like something I've read before. Of course, there are themes that recur. The text is interwoven with these reprises, which serve to express the fluctuation of time. You are the sort of reader who is sensitive to such refinements. You are quick to catch the author's intentions, and nothing escapes you. But at the same time, you also feel a certain dismay. Just when you were beginning to grow truly interested, at this very point, the author feels called upon to display one of those virtuoso tricks so customary in modern writing, repeating a paragraph for word for word. Did you say paragraph? Why, it's all page. You make a comparison. He hasn't changed even a comma. And as you continue, what develops? Nothing. The narration is repeated, identical to the pages you have read. Wait a minute. Look at the page number. Damn. From page 32, you've gone back to page 17. What you thought was a stylistic subtlety on the author's part is simply a printer's mistake. Okay. Now, the feeling you have hearing that is what Haydn is like the more steeped you are in music of that time. And for the people of his time, that's what it was like. Now, how do we know they thought that? Well, critics at the time wrote about, in Germany especially, wrote about Haydn's relationship to a British author you probably know, Lawrence Sterne. And they say that he did similar things in Tristram Shandy and Sentimental Journey. So here is one or two examples. Now, this is an author that it seems that Haydn was aware of. Now, that doesn't mean to say that Haydn was looking at literature and thinking, how can I do that in music? But, I mean, maybe it affected him, and maybe it did have subconsciously some kind of impact. Of course, they didn't have a subconscious then. It hadn't been discovered. So this is from Tristram Shandy. Digressions, incontestably, are the sunshine. They are the life, the soul of reading. Take them out of this book, for instance, you might as well take the book along with them. One cold eternal winter would reign in every page of it. Restore them to the writer. He steps forth like a bridegroom, bids all hail, brings in variety, and forbids the appetite to fail. All the dexterity is in the good cookery and management of them, so as to be not only for the advantage of the reader, but also the author, whose distress in this matter is truly pitiable. For if the author begins a digression, from that moment, I observe, the whole work stands stock still. And if he goes on with his main work, then there's an end to the digression. And this goes on for a while. And one more quote from the same author, Tristram Shandy. Therefore, my dear friend and companion, if you should think me, by the way, this is perfect Haydn, if you should think me somewhat sparing of my narrative on my first setting out, bear with me, and let me go on and tell the story my way. Or if I should seem now and then to trifle upon the road, or should sometimes put on a fool's cap and a bell to go with it, for a moment or two, as we pass along, don't fly off, but rather courteously give me credit for a little more wisdom than appears on my outside. And as we jog on, either laugh with me or at me, in short, do anything but keep your temper. So this is very often what we get from Haydn. Now let's turn to the actual Opus 15 number 5. And I think you'll find when you first hear this, that the very, very opening seems more normal than what we've been hearing so far. But we're going to explore how it's not. Reminds me of a doctor I knew who had been asked to do physicals on people who had been exposed to certain chemicals that made them very weak. But the doctor didn't know that they had been made weak. And they were all farmers from Wisconsin. And he was a New York doctor and thought they seemed pretty healthy. But then someone said to him, had you seen these people last year? And that was the problem. Okay, so here's the opening of the piece. I'll stop you when the time comes. Okay, now, I saw some of you already. First of all, why are they starting without them? I mean, if you thought that, good, because it's a little strange. They're playing this little thing, and there's no bass or middle voice. You know, it's just these two sopranos here. But then, when they come in, did you notice? They came in with a note that's not in the key. You probably heard, what was that? All right, so this is a little disturbing. Now, let's hear it one more time now that we know that, and then I'm going to give you two alternatives to this. Now, you notice the dynamics, too. They start softly and alone, which is... Now, I wrote out two versions of an opening. One is a complete little folk tune, which you don't get complete folk tunes at the beginnings of these works ever, because if there was a complete melody, well, you wouldn't get it in a first movement. You might get a complete melody in a theme and variations, because then you have your theme, which is complete, and then you have a set of variations. But if it's not variations, you always have a sense of incompletion so that the story has some place to go. For example, if it's a movie or a play or a novel, and the character gets up and has breakfast and goes back to bed, I mean, hopefully, at least they leave and go out somewhere where something can happen. You know? So here is the same music rewritten to be more complete, and so complete that it doesn't even need any more music. Done. Okay, so you're not going to get that because it's so complete that we don't need anything. Now, I wrote another version of it, which is more typical of early Haydn and Antonin Kamel, and you're going to look him up, you won't find much, but there, you know, and a lot of other people, where it starts off with all four of them, and it seems like it's complete, but it modulates, it changes key to go to the dominant so that we at least have the sense that something's going to happen. See, now we're in a different key, the dominant, so we think, now what? But Haydn did used to do things like that. But he stopped doing it when he became a little more daring and innovative, and he started to experiment with how music is written. And he had a great sense of humor. And as you know, or you will, so when I ask you if you knew this, you could say you do, because I'm about to tell you. You know, when people say, did you know, and then they tell you? I always think, yeah, I knew that. But anyway, we know that Haydn experimented so much and was one of the greatest experimenters of that time, and maybe in the history of music, because he had this job working for Prince Nicholas of Esterhazy in the palace there, where he was the only composer hired, and he had to write a lot of music, but the only audience for most of it was the prince, who was a wonderful musician in his own way, and was just... So Haydn said, I had no pressure on me. All I could do was experiment. He had nobody to stop him from experimenting. He had that job. Think how long you think a job like that. 30 years he had that. It's amazing. Mozart lived 35 years. But Haydn did a lot better, and he had this 30-year job of experimenting. So now let's hear the opening as it's written again, but go on to complete the second version. Okay, let's stop there, even though there's more. Okay, now, that could have been the opening of the piece. The first version is tentative. It's like sticking your toe in the water and there's a wrong note and people don't come in and it's quiet. Let's pretend that's the opening. Play that again and stop in the same place, but start there on the second phrase, pick up to bar 9. This is the opening. Okay, now that could be an opening, except there's maybe too much going on and openings are a little simpler. And you'll find, as you hear this piece, that he finally states a kind of opening-like version way towards the end, which is another technique that he's using of having things all mixed up. Now, let's think about those C sharps. The C sharps that came in the cello and the viola, which seemed like wrong notes, we have now he does resolve them. So even though these are wrong, he does give us a resolution. However, he knows that if those notes were placed in the violins with the stronger harmonic notes in the cello and viola, it wouldn't sound so disorienting and upsetting. So he does that second to say, I know how to do it. So for example, you get this. And then that's the same C sharp. See, it's the same, but because the low instruments are playing the correct harmonies and the high instruments are playing the wrong note, it doesn't sound like a problem. Because if you think of a building, the foundation needs to be sturdy. And what happens up here could be gargoyles, steeples, all kinds of decoration, and you accept it. But if the gargoyles and the decoration are on the bottom, and then on the top is the foundation, it seems wrong. And it's true with harmony too. And that's exactly what it does. Then let's go. We're going to go on now to play quite a bit more of it. Let's play. I say let's, but of course you guys are playing it. Do the entire exposition up to the repeat sign. And I'll just give you a couple of things to listen for. It'll start that strange way. Then the C sharps will be put up high. Then there'll be some fun, exciting music, which is perfectly charming and doesn't cause any trouble. But keep listening for every time it comes back, things are different. And they either get more complex. In fact, what you're going to hear, they're always getting more complex. And there are 3 ways that I can think of offhand to become more complex in this style. One is more rhythmic activity, which happens. Another is chromatic notes. In other words, notes that are not from the key that get in there somehow. So a C sharp, that's going to resolve. If there's a C sharp and there's a G sharp and there's an F sharp, it's getting more complicated. And the other is kind of ornamentation. So, and that all happens. So let's hear from the beginning all the way to the end of the so-called exposition. I say so-called just to draw your attention to that's what it's called. I have no problem with it. Okay. All right, that's up to the exposition. So the fast-moving parts, which are fun and racing around, have simple harmonies. He saves the complexities for whenever that theme comes back, ba-da-dee-da-da-da-dum, or bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum. That's where it happens. So when I mentioned geese and said they would come back, I explained why I said that, but I didn't mention Haydn and his geese in that, not that he had geese. He had a parrot. He did. He did, as do I. Okay, but that's just a sign of camaraderie. Anyway, what he does here is bum bum. The first thing you hear is those C sharps, bum 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 bum. That becomes like a goose in that you know, if you know Haydn's style, and you will hear it, that has to become more and more important. Bum 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 with those unexpected notes. Bum 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 bum. So he actually in this piece takes that as far as he possibly can by the end of the piece. The idea that those repeated notes will be stranger and stranger to the point where you can't even believe what's going on. I mean, don't you think that's true? It's really strange. Okay, so now let's hear, there's one little thing I wanted to point out. In a composer like Haydn, and there aren't too many, all right, in Haydn, every little thing, I noticed this from when I study any score, any little thing that catches my attention, any little thing that is worth noting is going to become something. It's never left out. So there's a really strange thing in the first violin that goes by so fast you really don't even notice it. You have, do you find anything odd about that? It's this, right? In other words, why didn't he do this? See what you hear the difference? He could have gone, but he goes. That's a ninth chord. You know, it's pretty modern harmony. It's very strange that yes, he did it probably at first because of two open strings. But he got there this way. So he could have kept doing it. And yes, it would have made it a lot more awkward, it's true. So he decides maybe for practical reasons to use an A. Can you show us that in slow motion so you can see the open string part of it? Or you're not playing it that way? You see, there you go. Okay. Yeah, now he might have wanted it that way, folksy. I don't know, it's worth thinking about. But it obviously wouldn't be hard for you to do this either, right? No. But at that time, no, it probably wouldn't, but at the time, if you see an A, you're going to play an open string. It's not like now where you probably were taught to avoid open strings at all costs, at certain points, you know. I mean, not at all costs. Okay, so anyway, here I'm basically pointing out this interval. And it comes back, I'll give you a little hint, like if you're at the movies. It comes back near the end of the piece after he has explored bum, 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 bum in the most extraordinary way. Then this huge ninth chord comes in, which is just incredibly modern and joyous in a strange way, and it's a reference back to that. Okay, so let's start with the development section. Now, did Haydn ever hear the expression development section in German or English? No, never. So how did he write one? No, it's important to know that all of these terms are added later in analysis. But they did have an expression that he did know. It was called characteristic section. They called it the characteristica or something like that. But the idea was that there was a characteristic passage in which you would take the most characteristic aspect of your piece, the thing that people would hook onto and do stuff with it. So it's like a development, but it was called the characteristic aspect. Very few people know that, especially in 2016. People used to know that. I mean, no. Okay. Now, so at the beginning of the characteristic section, or the so-called development. Now, when I don't love the word development, because yes, sometimes you have a real development, like in Beethoven. But here, it's not exactly a development. It's more just more of playing around with the same thing that he's already played around with, just more of it, and not much more of it. You know, it's more of the same. And he started so-called developing the idea right away. In fact, it starts off, it's already in the middle of something, which is what I pointed out here. So he adds a few ornaments, but the main thing that he does is puns, musical puns. Now, musical puns they're a genuine thing, and they're exactly like puns in language, spoken language. If, a very obvious, words can be spelled different ways and have different meanings. So T-O can be spelled 3 ways, and yes, and they mean different things, and it's possible to structure something so that it's humorous. But we know what a pun is in English. It's the same thing in music, because if he does this here, then this is a G sharp because it goes to A. But if he does this, then this is not a G sharp, it's an A flat because it's going to go to a different key. That's what a pun is. The word in music, musical terminology, is enharmonic. Do you need to know that? Yeah, isn't it great not to ask that question anymore? Do I need to know that? Apparently you don't need to know anything. So, shouldn't matter. But you see, this is what I mean. Context is where humor comes in. If you didn't have a context for that comment, you wouldn't think it was funny. And the context, because it's unexpected and is irrelevant, but then the connection is made, it's hilarious. Or at least it was at the time. But you had to be there. Okay, so if I play this and do this, and it goes up, it's a sharp, G sharp. If I play this chord, and it wants to go down, then it was an A flat. So, I mean, it's funny on the piano because you have to do it with harmony. On string instruments, it actually is a little different, but that's also context. It's not like you have to, you do it by ear. It's not like you have, I don't want to get into this, but it's mostly done by ear, and if you don't do it in the right context, it sounds like you're out of tune. That's what it is. Okay, so let's listen to the so-called development, the characteristic section. And I think what I don't want to give away all the surprises, so I'll just tell you to listen for the increased ornamentation and see if you can follow the puns. I just gave you the first pun. The G sharp goes up, and then it becomes an A flat and goes to a new key. This happens several times. We go to different keys based on these little puns. And then we'll stop at 101, the downbeat, right before the recapitulation. So this is the so-called development section. It's the goose. What do you think is going to happen now? Well, you are going to get that. And you're going to get the most normal version of it so far, because this is the recapitulation. So things get stabilized, but not for long, because unlike the expectation of the form, which it's better if you don't have any actually, but people do, instead of the recapitulation being really stable, it is really crazy. And it's much more developmental than the development section. And, and the only reason that's perturbing is if you've been taught a certain way and you think, well, this is outrageous. You can't have a more elaborate recapitulation in development. I would go back and redo that. Young man. Okay, but I'll give you a clue as to the best thing that happens. Right now, you just heard yeah, that's an old Victor Borge thing. But basically, it does go down to D flat. Actually, you know, with Victor Borge, what he does, it's the whole orchestra, right? He's conducting, and he has to turn a page so they all stop. We should have worked that out. But anyway, it does do this in the bass. And this D flat is the turning point back to the key. But that D flat also was the first wrong note of the piece. And then, but it was a C sharp then. But he doesn't expect you to catch this. He's going to come back to the D flat in a moment, and it's going to be huge. He's going to do, he's going to give you the C sharp, which could be a D flat. There it is again. And it's going to go into A flat major. Now, A flat major is just not a key that F major went to in those days, except in Haydn. Haydn, because of his jokes and his puns and his diversions, he went to all these keys that composers did not go to. These were far, they were complicated, they were hard to get to from these keys. So that becomes a big joke. He stays in the wrong key for a long time. Then you think the piece is really over. You will think it's over. And he starts it again. Okay, you say, well, okay, this will be a little coda. And then the bum, 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 bum becomes almost hallucinatory. And then it stops because he's thinking, I think I did enough of that. And he waits, and now he waits and there's a long pause. And I should say something about long pauses. There are certain things that we think of as part of the classical style, a big crescendo, a long pause, a sudden silence, or a section being divided by silence, and many other things. And I'll talk about this more next week. And a lot of them were the result of experiments in a city in Germany called Mannheim. And the Mannheim Orchestra experimented with all sorts of wild things. But anyway, let's go back and hear the entire, from the middle to the end, starting at the so-called recapitulation, and listen to those incorrect bass notes become really hallucinatory. They take us on a brand new path. Okay, now it's really fun. There were two pauses. I was actually talking of the shorter pause. There was also a really long pause, which comes before the hallucination, where he might have been thinking, what should I do? Should I do something crazy? But we also don't know whether the pause was ever filled in by the first violin. Who knows, Could have happened. But what happens instead is that Haydn does something that became a normal technique in the 19th century with people like Chopin, which is to just wander. It's like Spider on the keys, you know, it's wandering away chromatically, it's just going anywhere. Of course, it is controlled. It's not as wild as it would be with Chopin, but it does start normally. That's that same note. That's the D flat that I told you was going to cause trouble. Well, here it is causing trouble in the upper register. But it moves on, and it just keeps surprising us. And this, that's the ninth chord that we were hoping to hear. And it is very unusual to have a ninth. And of course, if something's unusual with Haydn, he's going to make sure you know he's not making a mistake. By repeating it a couple of times. I mean it. And then there's a pause, and then of course you think it's going to be over. But then you get this. And that chord is a normal chord in F major. It makes F the dominant of the subdominant. You don't need to know that, but we've been waiting for that chord. It's only been hinted at, or here it is finally, bang, at the end, and it low drops, and then all the way up to the top of the violin after dropping, well, not the real top, but the Haydn top. Oh, actually, Haydn writes fifths higher than that even, in some pieces. And that's it. Okay, so the divergences, the detours, the comedy of it is really the definition of the classical style. It's not an example of strangeness, or it's not an example of an unusual thing. This is the usual. So the idea that classical structures are forms in which you pour ideas is completely incorrect. Not that you thought that, but maybe somebody thought that. These forms evolve out of a natural kind of storytelling. And in Haydn's case, the storytelling is full of interruptions, just like Lawrence Stern, and just like Italo Calvino. And he plays with some of the most basic instincts we have, which is what starts at the beginning we expect to be our mother. Well, I mean, I'm speaking for the geese in the audience, but there's some truth to it. There really is some truth to it. So now it's time to hear the entire movement in all its hilarity and funness. And next week, we'll be looking at Mozart, which is probably more familiar. I have to say that Haydn remains, in some ways, a musician's composer. He's so loved by so many musicians, and his audience appeal is still linked to his most famous pieces. But you know, before we hear the whole thing, just a moment, I brought a couple of sonatas, piano sonatas, just to show you how normal openings, even by Haydn, are. Because normally you establish the key. So here's an F major sonata by Haydn that starts like this. That's nothing but the key and the dominant. Then he gets away from it. But he comes right back to it. And then the jokes are that he pretends he's going to get away from the key. But he doesn't. And then he does something dramatic. Different kind of humor. Now, one other example here. And this is to point out how the chromatic notes, the notes that are not in the key, in this quartet were put in strange places. Here, which is an earlier sonata, they are put exactly where they belong because this is earlier. So you start in C major. So we'll wait to see when do we first hear a note that's not in the key. Not yet. Not yet. See, there it is, but it goes away right away if you listen. So he's going, The whole point of it is he's teasing you away from the key and bringing you back. F sharp, watch out. So that F sharp changes everything. C sharp, that's what it should feel like. And we're in a new key. Because of the F sharp and then the C sharp, you put them together, you get D major. So that is, it's charming, but it's much more typical. You stay in a key, F sharp, and it moves you to G, C sharp moves you to D, and it's wonderfully done with humor, but it's still exactly what you expect. In the pieces we've been listening to, which are much later, and he wrote way after this is middle period music, he doesn't do that anymore. He does that, and I should say, he does not only that, he also gives you all sorts of hints at everything going wrong, of keys that you need to explore, possibilities and little dangers. You know they're not really dangerous because they're just keys, but they are metaphorically dangerous. Okay, here we go. Wow, this is my microphone probably. One more idea. We have a little more time, and it's just something occurred to me I just want to share with you. So, okay, the prince was talking, he was eating, and that's why you get those opening chords. Did you notice, it really struck me this time, that the big silence is right before the best part, right? In other words, there's that huge silence, and then the bum, 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 where it goes in all these weird directions. So it's probably because they were used to, or Haydn was used to, the prince having his attention wander, or something. And at that point, they wanted to get his attention. And a big chord is going to ruin the piece, but silence doesn't. So why don't you play right before that, and I'm going to be the prince, and I'll show you a modern version of the prince. Let's see, where is that exactly?
134?
Yeah, yeah. Let's see. Yeah, right before, go a few bars before. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, and I'll see you next week. Brother. Thank you. Must have been a funny guy. It's going to be a lot harder to do.
Oh, yeah. And then the Schubert.
All right.
Yeah.